if you have a question, you can either type it or you can go ahead and ask away.
So this is Akilele. Very, very excellent presentation. The Black Poor presentation. I had a quick question in regards to this particular session. I know Michael mentioned that there were about 7,000, or the numbers were probably around that 7,000, 10,000 mark for the Black poor. At that time, would you say that that was representative of all Blacks in London at that time, or was there a distinction between the Black poor group and the general Black population of London?
That is a figure that they would have put together for the general Black population. We have to also remember that the vast majority of Black people in England at the time were in very poor conditions because of the obstacles that were placed in the way that Iamide pointed out in her presentation. So you can almost say that the title of Black people in London or Black poor was almost synonymous in that regard. There might have just been, you could probably just count on one hand those who in the 1780s who were not poor. So granted, of course, this is just an estimate because there were no real figures surrounding exactly how many Black people were in London at the time. So the question I suppose arises then, if only less than 500 went to Sierra Leone, what happened to the rest of them? Well, we have to remember that the vast majority of them were men, Black men. They would most likely have acquired white wives. So if we look at Francis Barber, who was the assistant to the inventor of the dictionary, Samuel Johnson, he married a white wife. His mixed race child married had white partners, and his descendants to this day look white. And however, these descendants are very proud of Francis Barber as an ancestor, as David Olasuga's television program showed. But we'll have a lot of British people walking around now, especially in London, who don't realize that they're actually descended from the Black poor.
That's a really interesting, thing that you said. Yeah, no, because obviously as assimilation, yeah, we know, that sometimes you might be able to tell maybe from the hair once you go down the family tree. But that's an interesting thing to say that there's some that descended from the Black poor. That's very powerful actually. I wouldn't know it. I wouldn't know it. One of the things I was going to say before we take another question is I did come across a list on the National Archives thing that had the dead, discharged, ran, and you've actually put it into perspective now that they came off the ships because that was a ship that was ready to sail, and I saw dead, I know people died. Then I saw ran, so I thought, so that you actually clarified that for me. That's why I didn't put up the slide at the time. But yeah, you really did clarify that. But some actually came up because the ships were at the port for quite a while before they took off.
They were indeed.
That's it. Yeah.
Part of the reason was because the weather was so bad.
Okay.
That's why they delayed it for a few months before they actually left, which led to more deaths on board, which led to more passengers reconsidering whether they should take this trip, and as I say, some of them being discharged or running away.
The ones that were discharged, did they misbehave? Is that what you know? Because I saw the word discharge after dead, and I thought, hang on, what are they saying?
That seems to be the implication, that they were misbehaved, but it depends what is actually meant by the word discharged, because Equino disputing the corruption that was taking place, he was discharged. So he would have been numbered among those who were discharged. So when you think about just protesting at conditions could lead you to being discharged. So it's not necessarily bad behavior. You might actually look at it and say, this is righteous behavior. But they were punished as a result because the color of their skin wasn't quite right at the time.
Abraham Griffith, Elliot Griffith, he seems to be the very connecting piece between the Black poor and the Black loyalists. And I just, only in your presentation, I realized that Clarkson did not even want those two to connect. Interestingly, I mean, this whole effort of this symposium is to show that at some point on August 24th, 1792, the Freetown formed the Black Loyalists, and the Granville Town formed by the Black Poor eventually merged and became Freetown. And these folks were all from the same source of people trying to be free from enslavement activities. History has made them look like they are completely siloed, unconnected folks. And you guys have presented those other parts of the information that we were looking for to make that connection between the previous symposium information.
Adrian, is it me or your reception is we're not hearing all of what you're saying.
Boy, is it very
just
bad?
The last couple of sentences we missed.
Yeah, your last few sentences we didn't hear.
Okay, I was saying that eventually your presentations have shown is the folks from the Black Loyalists coming from the same circumstances of trying to free themselves from enslavement in their Americas, or were taking up opportunities to free themselves and for some way to be independent, and it sounds like that union of Granville Town and the Freetown by the Black Loyalists.
You're still, I think you might have to type that last
sentence. Well, I think I get the gist of what Adrian is summarizing.
He's saying the connections, huh?
Yeah. Yes. The unification of those two colonies was not as straightforward as we thought it was. As we see, Clarkson was opposed to it. So we have to give more credit to Griffith than we do to Clarkson for the fact that these two colonies ended up being unified. We have to remember that the failure of the Sierra Leone's the first colony at Granville Town was a great embarrassment, because the pro-slavery lobby back in England was ridiculing the abolitionists. Say, see, I told you it would fail. And the abolitionists now were searching for reasons as to why it would fail. And a number of the abolitionists said that, or implied that, the reason it failed was not because of us, but because those particular Black Londoners who went were of poor character, and that we needed Black Nova Scotians who are better character to come and restart the colony in Sierra Leone. So John Clarkson, being brother of abolitionist Thomas Clarkson, was probably influenced by that way of thinking, and so as a result they wanted to have nothing to do with the failure of Granville Town, which had to be because of the quality of the settlers that were there. Thankfully, Griffith, being one of the settlers and being a former secretary to Granville Sharp, had a certain amount of prestige and was able to say, you know, this is not the case. John, let these people in. They've suffered enough. So if I was going to single out one particular person who has played a significant role in the unification of the two colonies, it would not be John Clarkson. It would be Abraham Elliot Griffith.
Also, I think, I mean, they were taken by this Smithman. They were conned in a way, because it doesn't seem as if they really investigated what they were sending these people to. You know, seriously, even though there were some people, I was reading David's book, Olusona's book, where he mentioned there were people who were trying to say, look, don't just take this man's word for it, blah, blah, blah. But some of the Black poor actually believed what Smithman had said, apparently. So, and thought they were going to some utopia. Well,
There's,
just like the Americans thought they were coming to a utopia in England. Look at that song.
Yes.
Yeah.
There's a question in the chat from Iamide Lewis Coker saying, why were these Africans called Black poor? Why not Black Loyalists or Black Londoners? And that is quite right, because these were Black men who largely fought on the side of Britain in the American War of Independence. So they should have been treated as soldiers. They should have been commended as Black Loyalists. They should have been highlighted as Black people having to live in London. But they were never really welcome. That was the thing. They were never really welcome in London. And we also have to remember, at the time in the 1780s, soldiers, white or black, were generally seen as the scum of the earth. That's how Duke of Wellington described them in the Battle of Waterloo not long after, in 1815. And these soldiers never had, whether you're white or black, did not have the right to vote. So hence the level of contempt that existed for them. So the Black poor were seen largely as a burden, and it's their fault why they're poor. That's the attitude that was being taken. And because they don't have any rights to vote or anything, they don't have the ability to represent themselves, and hence this is the kind of treatment they received. So yes, they should have been called Black Loyalists or Black Londoners, but unfortunately they were seen as Black poor by both their detractors and those who were supposed to be helping them.
And they just wanted to probably bunch all the Black people together under one name. You know what I mean? Yeah. Like they do now. They do sometimes. They don't even know that Africa has so many countries, or there are different continents with Black people. Anyway, don't get me started.
Eden,
Go ahead.
yeah, just a couple of additions. I mean, in discussing London, especially 18th century London, we have to be careful in terms of how we think about London in the 18th century and London now, because I mean, 18th century London might have its more glorious and wonderful part, but 18th century London, for a lot of Londoners were not that wealthy. It was a society in which destitution was of serious concern to the ruling classes and to missionary society. So you are the condition of what was called the London Poor. All of the anti-poor, all of the welfare policies that are now present in a place like the United Kingdom were welfare policies that developed fairly late, up to the 19th century. What the social history of London would demonstrate to you is that there were tremendous concern among reformers about the seemingly irredeemable poor, Black, white, and from different colors in London. So I want to put that unfortunately the moniker Black poor has followed this group. But what we're talking about is a London population that was much larger and much poorer, in which Black people who are part of the larger population stuck out. And there shouldn't be particular, I mean, today we might be surprised that the fact that these people formed a relationship with women who were in very similar circumstances with them. So they came from the social, a particular social strata of society. I mean, for those of you in UK, other people in other parts of the world might not get what it means to live in a class society. I mean, living in the United Kingdom, your first social stratification marker is class. It's class.
Yeah,
and therefore what it means that you have a system that sometimes can allow people to momentarily, and in some cases, move beyond their class. But this is a heavily class society. So I want people to get a sense of that and why that particular group stood out. The second point, that's a very important point that has been hinted at and been mentioned again and again. And there's a reason why, as both Yamide and Michael pointed out, that somebody like Ikweanu fell out with the organizers of that effort to Freetown. This was, in a way, a kind of racism that permeated the process. That racism was different from the kind of racism, much more virulent and vicious racism that existed in the late 19th century that furthered colonialism. But this was a racially doomed project. And the settlement to Sierra Leone, it's not simply the climate, it's not simply the timing, it's not simply Henry Smith's cunning of the people who are interested in this group, or quote unquote, the so-called suitability or lack of suitability of the settlers who were being sent to Freetown. The reality was that when you look at the resources and the calculations that was made for the settler, it was pitifully small. I mean, historians have done work in comparing the various British settlements that were supported around the world, including the one to Australia and New Zealand. The provisions that were made for those settlements were completely of a different magnitude to those that were made out of Freetown. Part of the reason why the Freetown settlements, whether it was Granville Town, later Freetown, struggled so much was that the British were very, very much tight-handed when it came to really settling a people who were not familiar in that environment for a fairly long period of time. They sent the so-called Black Poor with stocks that would barely last them for about 6 months. So the first crisis that they hit was that it was just very difficult for people to put resources together. First, to defend the settlement, and second, for them to tide over to build any sustainable foundation for a durable colony. So I just wanted to outline those two factors.
Good points, and very valid points, especially with relation to class, because the British authorities were at the time also waging a war against the white poor. And very often when enslaved people would run away in London, the places they would run to would be Mile End and to Whitechapel. And very often the white working class there would help to hide the black poor. And so as a result, they were able to form small communities in Paddington, Mile End, Whitechapel. I think there's another one as well, Bow, I think it is. But anyway, those are the areas, and that's largely because
St. Giles.
St. Giles, yes,
is another one.
And that's largely because the white poor saw, in certain respects and in certain times, saw them as allies in the fight in this class war that was going on.
I have a quick question, and I'm sure the historians would know this, but in reference to what Dr. Rashid mentioned, as far as the larger context of the conditions of people, black or white, at that time, the social context, I guess. The settlement the British settlement that was at Bolama, off the coast of West Africa, I think might be Equatorial Guinea now, so something like that. I mean, that was done in the same year as the Freetown settlement when the Nova Scotians came in 1792. And in fact, I think that particular settlement was largely white. And I think a lot of white, poor white seamen were, I believe, recruited for that settlement as well. But I mean, would that be within that context, Dr. Rashid, in terms of finding some solution to that, problem, that social problem?
Yes, I suppose it would be. I presume that question's directed at me, yeah? Yes, so that would be very similar circumstances, because as we see throughout the British Empire, that they often used the white working class as their cannon fodder for their colonial ventures. So this was just a case of using the black poor as their cannon fodder for the first time in Sierra Leone. So yes, very similar circumstances.
Yeah, Amide, you wanted to say something, I think, before Akindele asked his question. So,
I think, okay, two things. One was to mention, to do with resources, even when, you know, I haven't finished reading the papers, but talking about lack of resources when they resettle people, that was the same they did with the liberated Africans as well. They really, you know, did not provide enough resources, but that's another, when you go to that symposium, that could probably come in. But I was just going to also just read another thing about, I keep going to Smithman, although Dr. Rashid has definitely explained, you know, there were more dynamics playing. But this man, I mean, he's one of his statements he made was, he assured the committee that a man possessed of a change of clothing, a wood axe, a hoe, and a pocket knife may soon place himself in an easy and comfortable situation. This is what he said about. So they probably didn't even give the people clothes or anything. You know, you see how he sold the place. So they probably went with maybe just the thing on their back and the this and, you know, so all that I think just contributed to a whole, you know, disaster in a way.
And I mean, they're thinking about that. I mean, this was how the Americas was sold. This was how the Caribbean was sold. I mean, the one of the logic of European imperialism or European colonial settlement was to sell places of varying climates, of varying resources, but most important, with people, because the part of the disaster, the crisis of that first group of returnees, the so-called Black poor, was that they went to a landscape that already had people there, and people who, no matter what the initial reception might have been, quickly turned hostile against them. Yeah. I mean, Granville Town was destroyed by the people that they met there, the people who supposedly had leased the land to them, turned against the settlement and destroyed them. So part of colonialism, and what did not go with that kind of settlement in Sierra Leone, but probably went with a kind of settlement in other parts. And we Sierra Leoneans should be thankful of that, is that the kind of colonial violence that led to the erasing of whole populations, whether it's in Australia, whether it's in New Zealand, or whether it's in the Americas or the Caribbean, thankfully did not accompany the establishment of the Sierra Leonean settlement. So we can look at a history where, as we can say, we can look at all of the problems that are inherent in this, but we don't look back and say, wow, the resettlement of these groups of Black people or Africans led to the genocide of people that they met there. So I think that that's important to put in perspective.
Yeah.
There's a comment from Brian Williams. I'm going to read it. He says, I think the concept of projection in psychology may help with this. The condition of the Black poor created intra-psychic discomfort for the ruling class, and instead of looking at their role for this condition, it was easier to blame them and get rid of them.
Yep, and that's quite right. That was definitely the mindset of the white ruling classes in Britain at the time. Easier to try and get rid of the problem. They had no particular motivation to find an amicable solution anyway. These weren't voters. But remember that voters were had owned large quantities of land to do so. So they were largely seen as disposable. So yes, it was much easier to blame them and blame them for their own condition. And that was generally the mindset in the 18th and 19th century, that the poor were poor because they deserved to be poor, and whether they're white or Black. And so in this case, yeah, easy to blame them for the conditions that they were in.
And you don't want a restless population amongst your mates that, as Michael pointed out, is going to unify with disaffected classes to challenge all kinds of authority. The discourse that led to Freetown was a discourse of freedom. Yamide, you mentioned that. Michael also mentioned that. It was a powerful discourse that Black people were shaping. Equiano's book was one of the first global bestsellers in the world. This was somebody who marketed a book that essentially gave a voice to, gave agency to, and articulated a particular understanding of what it meant to be free, not only as a Black person, but that notion of enlightenment, of freedom, that enlightenment was wrestling with.Ganisho, you had a group of Black people who were speaking on behalf of themselves and were making claims to freedom and equality in a language that was legible to white people. And that in itself was something in the 18th century that you didn't want to expand. So yes, there was a meeting of minds. You're concerned about them being poor and being an eyesore. You're concerned about problems of destitution. They are not people with any seeming rights in Britain, but their rights were not well defined, but so were the rights of a lot of white people who were not well defined at that particular point in time. The 19th century was going to define much more clearly the rights of white people right across Europe and in the United Kingdom. So it's in your interest to ship these people somewhere. And so, yes, Equiano and folks, yeah, we can get your folks to West Africa. But Michael, as you mentioned, as you said, the logic for resistance there is also understandable, especially if Black people said, but what are you talking about? Where do you want us to go? Our entire experience has been around white people in various capacity. And these will be people that would not only have been recently arrived in London, these would be people with very long experience of living and functioning in Britain. And they would have said, we have put our dues here, as you said, we have formed families. Why should we give that up to go somewhere? So as both Michael and Yamide pointed out, I mean, the logic here was very, very complex. And Freetown is one of the arcs of that particular story.
Yeah. I see also here where Akindele is asking, should the accepted label of philanthropists and abolitionists be reconsidered then when it comes to folks such as William Wilberforce and John Clarkson? Personally, I would say yes, because we should not place these people on pedestals because they have their own agendas as well. We have to remember, for example, well, we've spoken about John Clarkson and his perception of Granville Town. We have to remember also that while William Wilberforce was pushed very heavily for the abolition of the slave trade, he was actually not in favor of the immediate abolition of slavery itself. He, between 1807 and 1823, he advocated gradual abolition, which meant that if there, once we've abolished the trade, slavery will die out naturally. Well, it did not. And it took Elizabeth Hayrick to accuse the abolitionists of being fence sitters to get William Wilberforce and Thomas Clarkson off the fence to actually start campaigning for the abolition of slavery itself. So we have to be careful. As I say, some of these labels can give more of an impression as to their campaigning zeal than was actually the case.
And also, I mean, just Andele puts it in his book, the slave ship called Jesus, and he appeared last year on a talk that event like this, that really we had the Wilberforces, or as my friend says, the Wilberfarces, but it wasn't an altruistic thing. When they finally abolished slavery, it was more economics, isn't it? With all the rebellions going on in the Caribbean and, by the enslaved people themselves. That was what really, in my book, pitched it over the scale of abolition. Of course, they compensated the slave traders and the plantation owners, but not a cent went to the enslaved. So that just shows you the whole picture of what was going on then, you know.
A quick addition. Yeah, this is a big topic. I mean, I usually ask people in a seminar on slavery and abolition that I teach to make a case and argue for what eventually brought slavery. Was it the Enlightenment and liberal revolution that was going on? Is it the philanthropic and sort of the Christian impulse that drove people to act and to see the essential wrongness in enslaving other humans, in other words, the ethical shift? Or was it economics, as Iamide pointed out, that Eric Williams wrote his seminal book on capitalism and slavery, who argued that ultimately, and then Michael Creighton, another historian, also did wonderful work on the slave resistances in the Caribbean and how the system became unsustainable. So 4 different competing points of views. In an American classroom, I could never get students to argue that it was humanitarianism or ethics. They were, the majority of the class always came down on economics. And then I said, now I understand the country within which I live and I work at this particular point in time. Economic trumps everything. But the more I have thought and reflected about it, the more I have sort of shifted into putting forward and maybe trying to make a case for what I call the contradictory logics of abolitionism. And those contradictory logics speak to the fact that we as people seldom always act overwhelmingly from one particular impulse, that sometimes we act from competing impulses. So calling William Wilberforce and co-abolitionists and philanthropists, that some people would want to do that, and we would be right to contest those particular labels. But I don't want to take very completely or totally the fact that some ethical or some moral view, whether coming from religious place or a place of conviction, would have driven some of those folks to act. To do that would be playing into the kind of logics that racists argue about. So I think that the economist motives, all of those motives that we pointed out, all of those points that we pointed out were present there. But there were people who acted from Christian principles, the people who acted from Enlightenment principles. You wonder why generations of missionaries, knowing that they were going to die in Africa, went to Africa to die. You're asking, so what is it that is moving those particular people? So as I always say, for all of us, I want to leave some space in the fact that even in what sometimes might seem this dichotomy, racial dichotomy of white enslavers, black resistors, is to leave that space there to say history do allow people to shift in all kinds of ways. That they acted from motives of philanthropy, of care, and came to accept arguments that people like Equiano might have put up. That can't you see our common humanity? And remember, people can see common humanity, but they can still believe that they're better than other people. Those are not inseparable. Yeah, we're all humans. As we say in our salon, we all are mortal man. But you don't need to say, person not to say, I know better past you. So I want us to balance those contradictory logics. That's how I would say it, Akindele.
I think, to be honest, I don't know if that's what you said. I think it was a combination of all these things that you've discussed really that contributed to it. There was, I think there were those who had a heart, even if they were few. There were those who obviously saw it as no future in it because of all the rebellions and the money they were losing. There were those who thought Christianity. There were those, and there was also what I found, the sugar boycott. I don't know whether people are aware there was a sugar boycott in UK, where people were boycotting sugar because I'm talking about the general public who began to boycott sugar because they then knew that the way the people were being treated, and the production of sugar meant such hardship and torture to other people. So there was that. But that's probably the first official boycott that they had, you know, in England. I'll have to read more about it, but there was a sugar boycott, which would have contributed as well.